Hello, everyone. Welcome to panel Plenary 1A Emerging Knowledge Systems. I am delighted to introduce Dr. Irene Hewitt, who is Head of Evidence and Strategic Learning at Oxfam. I can hardly think of anyone who would be most fit to chair this session that will examine alternative ways of organizing global knowledge systems in order to face the challenges of the Anthropocene. So delighted to welcome you all. And dear Irene, thank you so much for your generous participation. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Javier. It's a real pleasure to be here, and we have a wonderful array of speakers and insights on offer to everybody. Um, you can put your comments in the comments chat, and I will be monitoring those to see what questions I can throw at the panelists when they least expect it. This session is about knowledge systems, emerging knowledge systems, and you'll see that a recurrent theme is about the injustices and how to rectify the injustices. So I'm sad to say that our first speaker, Professor Sabelo Ndlovu Gacheni, is unable to be with us due to COVID, but I wanted to briefly mention his what his contribution would have been, because it would have set the scene, and I think it still does, for the discussions. So he's professor and chair of epistemologies of the Global South, with emphasis on Africa at the University of Beirut in Germany, and has affiliations to many universities of in South Africa, and is a leading decolonial theorist with over 100 publications in the field of African history, African politics, African development, and decolonial theory. And for those of you who have bought or will buy the book, you will see that he has written about epistemic injustice. And he defines it, and I believe that that's a wonderful framing for all of us in our discussion now, as the deliberate non-recognition of diverse ways through which diverse people make sense of the world and their lives. And he says that he writes about how epistemicides um, are underwritten, are supported by genocides, by linguicides, the killing of languages, cultural imperialism, the theft of history, denial of possession, which is the denial of possession of history by non-European peoples, and even ontologicides, the exiling of people from their languages, cultures, and histories. And it's a wonderful background with which we are struggling today. Certainly in my work at Oxfam, we are working on trying to decolonize and shift the power in relation to who decides the questions, who decides the metrics and the units, who decides and is part of the sense making. And we saw a very poor show of it at COP26, which was the worst ever, apparently, appearance, or non-appearance, should I say, of diverse voices. And so by not having people in the room and not having their lived experiences and their understandings and their expertise in the room, we as a planet really miss out on what they have to offer in terms of solutions. So that's a kind of a general framing for us as we listen and share um, and learn about the emerging knowledge systems and challenges. So thank you to Professor Sabelo at a distance for his thinking. So the first person who will be speaking is Alexander Rusev, who's the professor of sociology at the University in Kristiansand in Norway. And he is a member of the steering committee of the Jean Monnet Center of Excellence there, and chair of the Sustainability and Digitalization Research Group. He works particularly on the intersection of knowledge production and decision making, particularly in the link between scientific knowledge and public deliberation and decision making, exemplified in COP, I might say, and what is needed, the preconditions and the pathways for opening up such knowledge production, and the consequences of very persistent knowledge inequalities. So he will be our first speaker. I'm going to introduce all three speakers that we have very briefly, and then I'll share with you how the panel session will go. Professor Audrey Gullo is a full professor of science and technology education and work at the University of Quebec at Trois-Rivières. And she contributes to training elementary, secondary, and special education, and also on training the future educational researchers. She particularly is interested in future teacher relationships with socio-technical controversies. And we'll be speaking about the options that teachers have in relation to dealing with such controversies. Our third speaker is Julia Paschunder, who's a behavioral economist with two doctorates. I don't often come across those, I have to say. And she's currently a postdoc in the Inter-University Consortium of New York at Columbia University. And the new school has got several Lifetime Achievement Awards, and including as a top educator. If you look at her publication list, you will understand what she's interested in. It includes the work on ethics of inclusion, and particularly how law and economic developments relate to the ethical dilemmas that we face in daily life related to healthcare, education, digitalization, and environment. So those are our three speakers. What I wanted to do after now is to give each the floor. They have about 10, 12 minutes to share with them their pet messages related to also the chapters. And after that, as you listen, keep the Q&As coming. I will try and distribute them and maybe plug them into the conversation. And after that, I will turn back to the speakers and ask them a question about what next. What are our options? So without further ado, can I welcome Alexander, Professor Rusev, to the floor?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Irene. Thanks a lot, Javier. And I'm really honored and pleased to be on this panel and have the challenging task to speak before such distinguished and interesting speakers as Julia and Audrey. As Irina already said, I'm a sociologist, and that's I take this very seriously. So I think my task is twofold. So I would like to talk a bit about the cognitive and conceptual frameworks that we might encounter when we talk about emerging knowledge systems. And of course, I would like to give this a very negative spin, as you can expect from a sociologist, because we hardly ever positive people. That's kind of our to start with thinking about the term knowledge. I see on my screen now just loading symbols. Okay, that was back on. We have to start with thinking about the term knowledge itself. And I think it's a very strange creature in a way, because if you read through the literature, you can find kind of a let's say a double definition here, or a double approach. On the one hand, knowledge is increasingly seen as a resource. We have all these debates about emerging knowledge economies, or even knowledge societies, in which economic growth, social cohesion, political participation are increasingly kind of channeled and moderated by knowledge and access to knowledge. At the same time, knowledge is often depicted as something like a public good, in the sense of Inge Cowan and others. And just to give you an example, what I mean is, as a fantastic, almost poetic depiction of knowledge in the World Bank report from 1999, but it has been repeated many times ever since. And I would like to quote here, because otherwise you will not believe me that the World Bank has written this. In this report, they write, "Knowledge is like light. It can travel easily the world and enlighten the lives of people everywhere." That's amazing, isn't it? It's fantastic. Of course, and it's really a pity that Sabelo couldn't speak before me, and we could have a nice discussion about this, because this is reminiscent of ideas of the Western Enlightenment, where knowledge was seen as this transformative force that would allow people to become better, more virtuous, and more happy, and it would also transform societies to the better. Unfortunately, and that's my key message, knowledge is not like light. I would even go further and say knowledge itself is not transformative. Knowledge is only transformative when it is, let's say, in the hands and minds of people. So only the bearers of knowledge are transformative. So as I write or as I emphasize in my work, knowledge should be conceived as a capacity to transform, as a capacity to act. So we have to, if we talk about and think about emerging knowledge systems, we can't simply focus on knowledge as a transformative force, but we have to keep in mind, how is knowledge reaching people? What are people, groups, movements do with knowledge? And then we can understand that, for example, knowledge, the accumulation of knowledge, is only one aspect in knowledge systems. Irene has mentioned the COP26, and I think that's something that we probably can most of us can agree on. Climate politics is a very good example. Regardless of how much evidence for anthropogenic climate change, the connection between human greenhouse gas emissions and changing climate will be accumulated, the knowledge itself will never force political action. There is no tipping point that convinces everyone, forces agreement or consensus. Scientific knowledge, indigenous knowledge, political knowledge, hands-on knowledge for people, local knowledge can become a transformative force, especially in climate politics. But it's not because of knowledge itself, but because it's becoming a crucial and vital part of forming, articulating political agendas. And that leads to my second main point, and that's why we should reject these romantic ideas of knowledge as a public good. Because a public good, as we all know, is non-rivalrous and basically non-excludable. And that's exactly what is not the case in emerging knowledge systems, or in existing knowledge systems for that matter. Knowledge is a strategic, important resource, and that's why there's always there are always good reasons to withhold knowledge from other people, to make sure that knowledge is not accessible or can't be used in a certain way, that people are silenced, excluded. Before we started this panel, Irene mentioned that she was a bit shocked. I'm sorry if I mentioned now how many people were excluded from the COP26, and that's exactly the point. I mean, that is a part of a knowledge system, to making sure who can't speak, whose perspective is not heard, whose concerns are not voiced. I mean, that is exactly why knowledge is not light. People are deliberately kept in darkness, if you allow me this metaphor here. And of course, this translates into not only into the use of knowledge, but it's also affecting our production of knowledge. It would be fantastic to have Sabelo here. I mentioned I could mention other scholars like Fran Collier from Australia, who makes the convincing case that our knowledge production system is deeply affected by epistemic inequalities, that is basically disadvantaging people from the global south to produce knowledge or make their knowledge the products of their research and their experience heard in other parts of the world, even in their own countries. This means that if we talk about emerging knowledge system, we have to start with a rejection, that's my main point, of these basically double definition of knowledge as a public good and as a transformative force in itself. Knowledge is increasingly seen as a private good and is increasingly privatized. We have other examples, just recent examples. Think about the debates about keeping patent rights to COVID vaccines, which is a massive problem, especially in the global south, preventing actually the spread of a knowledge product in this case. So we have a commodification of knowledge, and we have the build-in of inequalities in knowledge systems. That's why my central hypothesis, or my conviction is that emerging knowledge systems are more likely to deal with, channel, organize, and utilize knowledge as a private good. That's what we're increasingly seeing. And that means that we need to focus, on the one hand, on persisting in emerging knowledge inequalities in the systems themselves, so in the architecture of the systems. But we have to go deeper. We can't simply focus, let's say, on limiting the for-profit qualities of academic publication systems. That's a worthy criticism, of course, but at the same time, we need to go deep and talk about epistemic injustices and epistemic inequalities. So which knowledge is valuable and which knowledge is valued, and by whom? And only then, if we reject this, let's say, simple romantic depiction of knowledge as light, as the resource of the 21st century, and all these romantic simplification we find in many reports, we can understand how we should approach the architecture and the cognitive architecture of emerging knowledge systems. And I would come to a conclusion, looking at the time. I think, and this, especially for future empirical research, we should keep in mind that emerging knowledge system will evolve around vested interests. They will reproduce or perhaps even intensify existing economic and social inequalities. They will reflect political agendas. And instead of disseminating knowledge like light, they will challenge knowledge towards certain groups and withhold it from others, which means that some people will be kept in darkness. And that's on a very negative note, because I hope that the other two speakers in the panel will lift us up and provide us with some inspiring ideas for solutions. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Alex. Yes, indeed. Quite a stark reality check, I think, for those of us who believe in knowledge as a gateway to freedom. You have 20 minutes to think of positive news and positive options, but we'll come back to you. I won't let you off the hook. All right. Audrey, though, I think has got a slightly different story to tell from her experience with education and how you can work with the minds of young people and their capacity to act, to use Alex's definition. Audrey, could I give you the floor, please? Professor Audrey Gullo.
Yes, so I was invited today to speak about ways to reduce those epistemic injustices that about which Alex just spoke. So more precisely, my main message today is that education can be an arena for creating diverse, critical, action-oriented knowledge processes that expose young citizens to different epistemic tradition. So I am a specialist of science education, but I think that those ideas that I will talk about can be used in many kinds of education. So health education, environmental education, political education, etc. So first of all, to be able to reduce those epistemic injustice, teachers should work in a democratic or activist perspective. So when I'm speaking about a democratic teaching perspective, I'm speaking about being able to, teaching students to be able to take part in debates and social political decision-making processes relating to different issues that are of interest to them. So for example, social technical issues that are of interest to them. When I'm speaking about an activist perspective, it means that teachers should help students to be able to act, to make social actions in their communities, in their schools, in their cities, regarding social technical issues or environmental issues. So what those two perspectives have in common is that they help students to develop an emancipated relationship to knowledge and also to scientific expertise. Well, I said to scientific expertise, but it could be of expertise in more general ways. So in our book chapter, Isabelle Arsenault, Chantal Pouillotte, and I wrote about 7 principles to help teachers to reduce epistemic injustice and help students to be able to participate in social technical issues that are of interest to them. So the first one is to familiarize students with the effect of human activities on Earth. So we spoke about COP26 during the last minutes. So this should be, and this is an example of teams that could be that could be studied in class with children, with teenagers. We should speak with them about pollution, about climate change, about all of those themes. Often we think that students have already heard about this, that this was part of their previous studies, but the effect of human beings on Earth should be studied in classrooms in elementary school, high school, and even in university. Second principle, we as teachers and educators should accompany students in the problematization of interdisciplinary situations that truly interest them. So in our curriculums, often we are supposed to speak about specific themes, but we also have this kind of freedom to be able to speak about what truly interests students. So at this time, I think COP26 could be an interesting team with the students, but it could also be a situation like, I don't know if you have seen, but a few days ago in British Columbia, here in Canada, there have been huge rain, and there have been flooding, and the authorities said that it was related both to the forest fires of last summer, it was linked to climate change, it was linked to many other climate phenomenon. So this kind of theme should be worked with students, and we can, well, what is important is to speak about the social aspects of those situations, economical aspects, scientific aspects, the aspect linked to environment as well. So those situations could be worked on working with many different disciplines. Third principle, we should bring students to carry out actions and concrete projects, and those actions and projects should be linked to their local realities. So we often think that in class we should study some themes. Yes, we should study them, but we also should bring students to act, to make social actions in their own cities, in their own area, and students are able to choose those actions, to plan them, and to do those actions. We should also not be afraid to highlight asymmetries and injustices with the students. We often think that education should be neutral, that we should, we often think that we should not politicize education, but this is not true. It is correct, it is okay to speak about the political aspects of the phenomenon that we are studying, and we should highlight those asymmetries and injustices, because this is the way that the students will be able to act on them and to truly reflect about them. We can also encourage students in the development of an emancipated relationship to knowledge. So relationship to knowledge is a concept that comes from the French sociology of education. And when we speak about an emancipated relationship to knowledge, we speak about having a relationship with oneself as someone who is able to learn, to reflect, to act. Also, an emancipated relationship to others, as I am someone who is open to diverse discourses, but at the same time, I'm able to be critical of dishonest arguments. And also, developing an emancipated relationship to knowledge, this is having a relationship to the world that means that I'm able to act towards the common good, and I'm also able to act to protect different species and the environment. Sixth principle, so there are 7 of them, being able to, as a teacher, being able to recognize and push further students' critical position-making capacities. So we often think that students and citizens in general have a deficit in knowledge regarding, for example, science, a deficit of comprehension or a deficit of interest toward those situations. But sociology of science has shown, well, for the last 30 years, so this is not new, it has shown that it is false, that citizens are able to understand complex issues, that they are able to act on those issues, they have interest. So as a teacher, we have to start from this point so that students are able to do those things and to push further those capacities. And seventh principle, teachers should present concrete case of successful citizen mobilizations to students. So in all of our cities, in all of our environments, there are citizens who were able to act and to make significant changes in their, sometimes regarding the environment, sometimes regarding social projects, etc. So students should know about those cases and they should meet the citizens and the organizations who have worked on those projects. So more concretely, what can we do in the classroom with our students to work on those 7 principles? So I will give you 4 examples. I just spoke about concrete cases of successful citizen mobilizations. Often, those cases are going to court. Not all of the times, but many times they are going to court, and social hearings in many places are public. So Chantal, who is one of the authors of our chapters, often brings her students to court hearings so that the students can see how the citizens are able to change, how they are able to contribute to environmental projects, for example. We also use documentaries, graphic novels, all kind of movies, plays, in which we can see citizens who act in their areas. Another interesting way to work with students is to meet with those engaged citizens. And the last one is there is a theoretical and pedagogical framework called Stepwise. Stepwise means science and technology for the well-being of the individuals, societies, and environment. And students who work in this theoretical and pedagogical framework have to lead their own action-based research that lead to political actions, political changes in the students' environment. So there are many ways to work with those 7 principles in science classrooms, but also in political classrooms, social studies classroom, etc. So what I want you to remember from this short presentation is that there is hope and that there are many things that teachers can do to reduce epistemic injustice.
Wow, that's a beautiful counterbalance to the story by Alex, both of which have a place for us in terms of how we choose or how we tackle and work with knowledge. That's wonderful. I'll come back to the notion of hope at the end. So thank you very much, Audrey. We're moving on to Julia now, who is going to take the very specific case of economics as a particular dominant, very dominant, I must say, epistemic tradition at the moment that is sometimes frustratingly dominant, but also has some hope for us, perhaps, when it comes to justice in relation to the climate emergency response. So, Julia, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Irene Gruot and Francisco Javier Carrillo Gamboa and Günter Koch to invite and curate this amazing panel that came out of a common book that was written or edited by Francisco Javier Carrillo Gamboa and Günter Koch on knowledge in the Anthropocene. And it was a multidisciplinary approach. It's out with Edward Elgar, really coming a few days before the conference. And for me, what was really beautiful is that also this panel reflects a truly international and multidisciplinary approach, which really also resonates with the book. And I will try to share some slides. I hope you can see the slides right now. And I want to speak a bit about climate justice and in relation to knowledge systems. So as we can see, hopefully in the graph, the world surface temperature has been rising since the beginning of... Yes.
Julia, you're showing the cover page of the slide. So we're not seeing the graph yet.
Okay, then it's not working the way I anticipated it. Then I will...
It is. It just moved to the third page, but if you go to the second page, we'll see the graph.
Thank you so much. Yeah, now I better see what's going on. Thank you so much for again. Thank you so much, Dr. Guit, to organize also this panel so on top of things. So and mentioning this. So the world surface temperature, as we hopefully can see now, is rising since the beginning of measurement. There's a rising trend. But what is for me the most striking in the climate change problem is this inequality. On the one hand, within society, some parts of society are bearing a higher burden of the climate change problem, but also over different world countries and over different overlapping generations. And as was said correctly, I am more an economist, but for this panel, I really want to focus more on the knowledge systems. And I want to debate a bit how climate justice can be enacted. And I think it always has to, because it's such a complex problem that is uniting the entire world. It has to come, on the one hand, from a top-down approach, but also, and very importantly, from a bottom-up rising. And in the top-down approach, I do believe that global governance institutions have this international outreach, the worldwide impetus, but also this long-term vision that, for instance, the United Nations goals have, the World Bank with the focus on international development, but also the International Monetary Fund, that can really also peg conditionalities on funding that is targeted at international development. The WTO right now raises high hopes with this promising new leadership. So the first female director general just was voted, elected in, and she comes from Africa. So that raises high hopes that really also top-down institutions can imbue this notion that within climate change there's this inherent injustice. In the bottom-up approach, I hope we will see more of a change of the narrative. Social representations can really show, and Professor Alexander Rusev can potentially tell more about this in his sociological approach, but social narratives can change, and the climate change discussion is often very much focused on only the negative downsides, but I hope that in the future we can open up this discussion and show that there is this inherent inequality, and then that there are potential parties involved that are gaining from climate change. And I will speak about this in the end of my presentation, who might be gaining, but I only shed light at the potential gains of a warming globe in order to show redistribution patterns, how to share the gains with those who are more losing. And I really enjoyed also from Alexander Rusev that he said that some parts of society are potentially having a disparate, harder burden or impact, and we definitely need this for creating a new narrative that climate justice really falls harder on some parts of society or some countries in the world. And already nice approaches that are speaking about knowledge systems that might change the narrative are these ideas of a global Green New Deal, a global entity like the World Bank, IMF, United Nations, or World Trade Organization that imbues and pegs rescue recovery funds, but also targets economic aid that is going to green larger solutions. And in the hopefully phasing out of the COVID-19 pandemic, we hopefully will see a more pegging rescue and recovery aid to causes that build a lasting legacy, to large-scale investments, and climate justice will hopefully be that. What I want to focus in the last 2 minutes of my presentation, I just want to briefly say that I have researched, and this is what is shared in the Knowledge in the Anthropocene book, on the economic gains and losses of climate change. I created this model in which I assume that every country has a different starting ground, a different mean temperature. We can agree that, for instance, Canada has a different mean temperature than Australia. Every country from the economic perspective has a different GDP composition. So productivity is measured in GDP, and that usually has these 3 pillars of agriculture, service, and industry sectors, and every country is different on that. And we also have different peak temperatures when these pillars can be the most productive. And out of these 3 variables, the mean temperature, the peak condition of the GDP composition, when a country can be most productive, I derive this idea that some countries potentially have in the future, 100 years from now, maybe rising GDP prospects given climate change. And this is really first results on this, as you can see here in the world map. The greener the country, the more time a country has ahead, and the redder the country, the more a country will have run out of time in the next 100 years. When you purely measure it on economic factors, I already, and here I bring it back to the climate injustice aspect, I already find over 181 countries of the world right now that those countries that are winning or have a gaining prospect from climate change are also emitting more CO2. And I find climate-induced migration and financial inflows into the areas that have a rising GDP prospect in the next 100 years from the warming of a globe. And as you can see in the left bar chart, the 1/3 of countries in green, those are the winning. Yes.
We're still on that first slide. It hasn't been moving.
Oh my, yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, so that it's obviously not working the way as anticipated. Yeah, I'm very sorry for this. I don't, yeah.
Can you show, okay, so we're now seeing bar charts.
Yes, so this is what you should be seeing, and I will try to show it like this. I'm so sorry; it's my first time on this live stream tool. But yes, so as you can see, the green countries are the 1/3 of countries winning. But when I only show the gains, this green bar shifts up. And that shows that only a few countries in the world will be gaining a lot. And here, this is the very last piece that I want to leave you with. one more time, I only show these economic gains in order to show how to redistribute it. This is grounded in ethical notions of Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative. You should only engage in an action if you want to have this action being done to you. Hans Jonas then extended this to the environment. Don't treat the environment in a hostile way that you would not want to have being occurred on you. And John Rawls' veil of ignorance, of course, speaks about every ethical predicament should be analyzed without knowing whether or not you would gain or lose from it. And here in this graph, I show a redistribution scheme in which I factor in also GDP per inhabitant. And the greener the country, the more a country should be giving from the expected gains, hopefully taxing industries that are carbon emitting into the red countries that have the highest prospect that they will lose out on climate change in the next 100 years. And with this, I very much look forward to your questions and discussions. And one more time, thank you so much, Dr. Guit, for really pointing out that the screen was left behind.
No problem at all. My pleasure. Thank you, Julia, for our deep dive into how to think differently about climate in terms of justice and gains and benefits. I think there's a lot to explore there in terms of how economics can become a servant of justice rather than its current track record shows, I have to say, in general. But without, can we maybe see all the panelists on screen? Because we now have an opportunity for 15 minutes or so to ask questions. Thank you very much, the magician behind the scenes. We have a couple of questions that have already come in, one to Alex and one to Audrey. So Alex, I think you can also see the comments of the questions. And what is,
no,
oh, you can't.
I can't.
Oh, okay. Well, let me read it out to you. I think it's in the comments column of your screen, if you can see it on the right side of private chat. Oh wow, this is somebody who definitely.
Oh, now I see.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Raphael. So here's your question.
Huh. Oh, thanks. It's an easy one. Well, I could. That's a really good question. The question, I mean, in order to answer it, of course, we could. I could question which political leadership you mean in particular. I mean, do you mean a general trend or in a specific country? I try to, but I think I can answer it. Of course, we have certain tendencies that are often promoted by international organizations that point in the direction of commodification of knowledge. The most obvious, and I think one of the most controversial examples, is the decision of large supranational bodies like the European Union, for example, to accept that patents for COVID-19 vaccines can be kept private, which is not given. Julia would be the better conversation partner to you, because I think that's a really interesting question, because there was a shared financing system, was a lot of public money was put into this research. So you could actually argue that why on earth are private companies like Pfizer and BioNTech in Germany allowed to keep the profits of research that was based on public emergency funding? I mean, I'm not an economist, but in general, I would say, of course, the problem seems to be that and I think that's also something Audrey could answer much better than me. The education systems are increasingly judged by standards of investment. So we often have all this sort of investing in university, investing in education, building, educating the knowledge workers of the future, and so forth. And of course, if you start with an investment logic, then you want something. Then it's very obvious that you want a return on investment. And if you put this together, that at one and that knowledge as a product is increasingly commodified, and education is increasingly seen as an investment, I would say yes, we have a general trend towards the commodification of knowledge, which means knowledge is a private good. That's my 2 cents. But the others can answer this much better.
Okay, but then I guess maybe the implication of the question, as I read it, is democracy, is a change of government, which is what's kind of implied, because Raphael talks about political leadership in recent years. Can we actually, is changing rulers, is that a potential route to decommoditizing knowledge?
Well, I mean, I would in general say when I give talks on climate politics and climate knowledge, I would always compare it to the struggles about the welfare state and social politics, and it has never been consensual, and knowledge has played a certain role in empowering people and helping them to specify their demands. And I think yes, in this sense, if you see it all as a political struggle, I would say yes. You could, for example, make the point, especially if you look at the global south at the moment, how they struggle to have affordable access to vaccines. This could be, of course, you could demand a leadership change. You could demand a policy change. The question is whom you would address: national politicians or international bodies like the United Nations, the WTO, and so forth. I mean, that's. But it's an interesting question, yeah.
All right. So moving to Audrey, a question for you is where our hope comes from, the hundreds of millions of little change makers that we see in schools. How can you work in an educational environment with critical social and economic issues, given that we live in this very polarized world? And you have hinted at it in one of the principles that you mentioned.
Yes. So first of all, we should not stop to teach those social, technical, political issues because of this polarization. On the contrary, we should continue to do that. And there are a couple of ways to do it. The first one is to lean on the curricula. So in each curriculum, there is something that we can lean on to teach those issues. For example, here in the Quebec curricula, which is a Canadian province, we are supposed to teach climate change. So this is part of the science curricula. And also we are supposed to teach opinion building processes, for example, in science education. So, well, if I understand that the issues that we choose to teach can be questioned, I understand that some parents or some leaders can disagree with what is taught, but still when we are leaning on what is already written and accepted in the curriculum, this is a way to have more legitimacy in this teaching. We can also choose what themes to examine and which themes we don't want to examine at the moment. So for example, when we are in a classroom and we feel this extreme polarization, we can decide not to examine the issue right now. We can wait a few days, for example, or a week or till next class, which could be like the next day or a few days later, to take time to prepare and to choose which arguments we will use and which we will not use at the moment. And there are guides that were prepared for teaching in a polarized environment. For example, there are guides to teach sensitive issues, so which can be related to climate, but which can also be related, for example, to wars or to genocides. And there are also principles existing to teach difficult knowledge, so knowledge that is, that can be difficult in an effective way. So all of those questions have already been examined by researchers and guides exist. So we can also lean on them.
So no shortage of options. In fact, in Oxfam, we recognize also schools as a really critical pathway for society to change, and we have a whole resource section in our system where we take actual events and we transform them and relate them to the existing curriculum here in the UK by feeding it with just other ways of looking at issues, and in that way, hopefully, creating some more solidarity and connection with people and issues that are not being experienced in people's daily lives here and in kids' daily lives. So, do you teach GDP is a question I would put to Audrey, but let me take it to Julia, because a question for Julia is about the validity of GDP as a measurement that beats all drums, frankly, of economic growth and of the kind of commoditization that Alex was referring to. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Kathy Garner, for this excellent question. And this is exactly the weakest point of the entire model, the focus on only GDP. I have to admit, I'm only a humble economist. So we need, and here again, thank you so much to Francisco Javier Carrillo and Günter Koch to invite me to present this very focused idea, but presented in the larger mosaic of a multidisciplinary book. And we need professors like Professor Rusev or Professor Gullo to really open up this one-dimensional view. I only focused on GDP because I wanted to start with a very minuscule model that everyone agrees on, and where there are not too many moving parts. But I have to admit, I'm presenting this since around 2016, and this is the one point that people say you have to put more variables into it. So you can do this. I'm not going to torture you with more slides, but I did then do iterations with also climate flexibility. So how much of a range of temperatures a country can offer. And I see this as a future climate wealth of nations and a trade asset that countries have. So think about if in a country you can go skiing and in a country you can go to the beach, you simply have more to offer in terms of the trade asset of the service sector, that people can do vacation on a mountain and on the beach than if you only have one flat climate zone. I also factor in CO2 emissions as the cause of climate change. CO2 emission changes in order to set economic incentives for countries to change. And there I see beautifully, I have different indices over time, and there I see beautifully that the US is a country that is initially a country that is obliged to give. But then due to a CO2 emissions drop in 2019, this shifts and the US is taken or is lifted some of the burden of responsibility to give due to a positive market change to curb CO2 emissions. And then I also, and this is the newest iteration, I also phase in historically grown bank lending rates, because and this is one of the key takeaways from the COP26, in order to fund climate change mitigation and adaptation, we will need so much money. And here again, I'm back to Professor Rusev saying that the disparate impact, some countries simply have historically grown way easier access to financial means than other countries. You have to factor that in also in order to leave these historically grown hierarchies and imbalances that also Dr. Guid talked about in the beginning, that we saw in the COP26, that we still are ingrained in historical hierarchies that we have to leave and open up the table. But yeah, thank you so much for the question, and definitely just the starting ground for other multidisciplinary approaches to add or change the model.
Thank you very much. Personally, GDP is well overdue a refit, I think. It has not served us well in the past to value weapons factories more than people who care for sick fellows, citizens. It really needs to be overhauled. And there are attempts to try and do that. So there's a rich literature, talk about emerging knowledge systems. We have Mariana Mazzucato and we have Kate Rayworth and a few economists who are really daring to step outside the boundaries of the constraints of economic knowledge and say, wait a sec, there's a completely different way in which we can understand what matters and what is valued. So thank you for the question, Kathy. So are there any other questions by people that we can have in the chats, or maybe between the panelists, actually?
Maybe just a follow-up on the GDP. We also don't measure or don't know how artificial intelligence plays into GDP. And this is a problem, because this is such a market revolution, the digitalization disruption, and we don't capture it properly in GDP. We don't know exactly, because on the one hand, and also the relation to sustainability, on the one hand, you can make the argument the cryptocurrencies are the worst by needing so much energy. And on the other hand, you can say artificial intelligence. I didn't have to fly to Brazil to be with you today, so I saved on thanks to technology. So this is also a question that's not answered.
Indeed. Alex, any thoughts? So did you want to have a question for others, or shall we start to do the round?
I have a quick question to Audrey, if I may.
Sure.
Because I just find it fascinating when you said in your talk that in a way you're giving power to young people to talk about what really moves them, and I think I'm just curious, because I know that teaching normally takes place in a relatively rigid system, and there's a curriculum, and there's something that is, I mean, it's not, teachers don't decide what they want to teach normally. There are certain expectations and often very strict rules. And because I'm just asking, because we try to do something similar. We try to basically gather local climate knowledge stories, because sometimes it's really empowering. It's really interesting to people tell you stories about local climate impacts, but they wouldn't call it like this, obviously. I mean, they wouldn't say it's climate change. They would say, well, my kids can't go ice skating in the lake where I used to ice skate because it's too warm now. And the question is, how do you balance this, that you have external expectations that often top down, and then you have this experience, and from your talk, I think they're actually very valuable, that this bottom up involvement and participatory learning is so much more valuable. I mean, that's my question.
This is a very interesting question. First of all, it is not all of the educational systems that are so rigid. So some of them are more rigid than others. And for example, here in Canada, we have an educational system that is not that rigid. So for example, well, each province has its own educational system, but here in Quebec, we have to teach in elementary school some competencies. So 3 of them in science. The first one is related to problem solving. So we can work on many themes regarding problem solving. The second one is being able to use knowledge in different contexts. So here too, we can work on many themes. And the last one is related to scientific language. So it's about the same in many different disciplines, subject matters. So we do have this kind of freedom. What we are teaching our future teachers is to know the system in which they are working, to understand thoroughly the system in which they are working, so they can know what is the exact frame and what is their freedom in this frame. So in many jurisdictions, there are general themes that must be examined in school, but the way we do that is not always precise. So this is a way to have this kind of freedom. So if we are working on competencies, they can often be used to debate, they can often be used to act, to do social actions, etc. So know your system to be able to use the freedom that you have.
I think that's a beautiful way to end, because I also feel that systems change, and really understanding where the levers for change are, and where you can make a difference is absolutely where some of my work is heading as well. I'm working at the moment on an evidence base for hope. We talk about hope, and we don't see that, but there are some phenomenal examples out there of what I would call meso, but even macro level changes that come about through voluntary concessions, but also through the pressure of engaged and critical thinkers and change makers, including from children. So we have another couple of question about the AstraZeneca story. There's an enormous amount to be said about that. Oxfam was one of the founders of the People's Vaccine Alliance. There's an enormous amount on the web about that, and there's no doubt that a lot will be researched about the politics in which this all transpired. And yes, there are theories that the competitors were intentionally trying to blame AstraZeneca because it would have blown open the whole patent market for everybody, not just for that particular company. But thank you for your observation, Gunther. I'm afraid we don't really have time to answer it because we're heading towards the finish line in 3 minutes. I'd like to give the floor to the panelists with one very concrete action that you feel can make a difference in relation to knowledge systems so that they become a force for good. So what would be your soundbite? Let me start with Audrey.
Yes, so I will do it very short. Believe in young citizens' capacities.
Fantastic. Alex.
Dare to accept that conflicting knowledge and disagreement might be the driving force we need.
Yes, contestation. Julia.
Given that the last largest pandemic that hit the world ever enlightened the world with the Renaissance, I would say that knowledge is one of the most important components to really enlighten us. So as we have a phasing out a pandemic, so I would say knowledge is it.
All right, well, knowledge is it, but it's clearly not uncontested. We have the doomsayers and we have the glass half full people in this field. Again, thanks to all of you for writing the chapters, for being ready to share here, and thanks to Sabelo, who we hope will, Professor Sabelo, who we hope will recover soon. Javier, I don't know if I hand back to you now or if this is it. Thank you to the audience. If not, our task is done. So I give you the gift of time, 1 minute to your lives. Thank you very much. Have a very good conference.